Corruption in boxing here. Post-fight video. George Groves, Chris Eubank Jr., WBA super middleweight and IBO 168-pound unification as part of the World Boxing Super Series semi-final that took place yesterday in Manchester. First of all, I would like to pay my respect to the UK bookmakers, specifically Paddy Power, Betfred, Bet 365, for their generous odds for the winner George Groves. The precarious odds positions that we spoke about in the preview that were bizarrely in favour of Chris Eubank Jr. As to why the odds were in favour, well, the answer was revealed in that fight. The scoring, one of the judges had it by 115, 113. The judge in particular was Malcolm McDonald. Mr. McDonald should be subjected to a year worth of waterboarding, and his bank account should be perused. That fight was specifically geared to rob George Groves. I thought it was going to be pre-populated scorecards, and the referee was certainly coerced as well. He did everything in his capacity to try and to protect Chris Eubank Jr., allow him to get away with indiscretion after indiscretion. He should have been warned, deducted points for bum rushing with his head, elbows, holding George Groves up against the ropes whilst hitting him after the bell repeatedly. But bizarrely, he was warning George Groves for those apparent fouls. Words cannot just, emphasize how disillusioned I am. And come to think of it, Chris Eubank Sr., I don't know whether you guys saw, he was actually dressed like a referee. At first I thought his ego is so big enough that he's just going to try and command the middle of the ring and adjudicate the fight. But metaphorically, the referee was Chris Eubank Jr. So, okay. I mean, let's go back to the start. Now, Chris Eubank Jr. comes out, takes his robe or whatsoever, reveals his Greek goddess-like physique, flexing his abs, as he did in the after the weigh-in. That scene immediately reminded me of the great motion picture from the 70s, Enter the Dragon, specifically the duel between Bruce Lee and O'Hara. They're at the standoff at the beginning before the contest starts. O'Hara pulls out a wooden board and breaks it. This obviously is designed to intimidate Bruce. Bruce Lee just looks at him with a look of and just says to him, "Boards don't fight back." And that is Chris Eubank Jr. for you. He was O'Hara. Comprehensively got his ass kicked. Then he would even resort to, picking up a broken bottle. Wouldn't accept that he's the inferior fighter. Resort to any means to try and achieve victory. But all right. Okay, round one, early on in the fight, the crowd are dumbfounded. Chris Eubank Jr. unwilling to engage. I heard the narrative that both fighters were waiting for the other to lead. Now, whoever made those statements are completely incompetent. George Groves is the counterpuncher, so why is he going to lead? Chris Eubank Jr. was promising in all of these pre-fight face to face, and all the numerous press events that he was going to walk George Groves down and knock him out. He reassured everybody that prognostication was going to come to the fore. Did we see that in the ring? Absolutely not. And the reason why Chris Eubank Jr. Was so reticent to walk down George Groves, he was reticent at long distance to fire his jab, didn't try and utilize the jab at all to try and set up any power punches, is because he had no confidence in his chin. You know, that is 100% the truth. Chris has been repeatedly pushing the narrative that he has his father's chin, something that Senior is very, very quick to corroborate, you know, as a father would do, trying to, you know, protect their son. But the truth is that Chris Eubank Jr. does not have his father's chin. He has his mother's chin. Shout out to a colleague who knows who he is, who literally deduced that from perusing the family pictures. But it was obvious in all, you know, the prediction videos that we already posted, that you know, Spike O'Sullivan wobbled Chris Eubank Jr. after Abrahams buzzed Jr. up twice in that fight, whilst laughing at his pillow-fisted power. Chris has been, you know, chin-checked, and I didn't see any robust granite chin. So to me, you know, I took Chris, you know, he was endeavouring to try and hypnotise all. It was almost the Muhammad Ali effect, you know. I am the greatest, so the media hence are hypnotised by that, and they just proliferate that view, and that becomes the narrative. When you have a convincing orator, you know, they say the pen is mightier than the sword, and the mouth, the equivalent to this, achieved exactly the same. All of the bravado, all of the talking, you know, had just hypnotised the bookmakers, had hypnotised the neolithically incompetent UK pundits. For God's sake, TalkSport Radio was covering this fight, you know, and their ability to break down boxing is just non-existent. They really are, you know, the epitome of stupidity. George Groves from the early stages, you know, he's the more accomplished fighter, both technically and fundamentally. Punch selection and also strategy, and the experience that he's had sharing the ring, been involved in very high pressure fights in front of 80,000, fights in Vegas. That experience people take for granted, but it's invaluable. Junior, conversely, he was certainly impacted by the gravity of the occasion. His objective was simple: to try and knock George Groves out. Another fallacy that he's been force feeding to everybody. When you've been fighting, you know, heavy bags on sneakers like Avni Yildirim, a Turk-based German who didn't understand what Guernsey links means, Guernsey Reshta, straight up and down. When he comes inside the pocket, his head is so much over his feet. It's just an invitation for somebody to knock his block off. So, you know, Junior obliged, but was that such a monumental achievement? I think my 80-year-old mother, if I'd given her a week training camp with me in the corner, would have been able to have, you know, touched up, yielded him a few times. But George Groves from the early on was able to establish his jab, controlled distance. That was the key. Junior so reticent to walk him down because he was afraid of, he was weary of George Groves' power. Now, all of the pre-fight talk that he didn't have any respect for George, you know, he's invariably slow and all of this, he's a faded fighter, he's washed up, etc. All utter garbage. When two men are engaged in combat, you know, there's no, with their lives on the line, it's you know, honesty prevails from that, and you can decipher it from the action. Chris Eubank Jr. had enormous respect for George Groves' power. That is why he didn't try and walk him down. That is why he didn't try and box him from the outside, because he knew he was, and in retrospect, it was the right thing to do, because he would have been knocked the fuck out. George Groves was able to connect with the jab from the first round, and hard jabs as well, quick jabs, straight right hands. But the one punch George landed repeatedly, which he couldn't miss all night, was the right hand to the body. Junior was hurt consistently throughout the fight. He was dropped in the fight twice, which early on, a chopping left hand when Junior was trying to jump from long range, avoid mid range, straight inside the pocket. That was his strategy. He knew that George Groves would pick him off coming inside mid range, so he just tried to bum rush him like a poor man's Sean Porter. But even then, George would able to, you know, step to the right, fire the right hand, change the angles, make it, you know, far more difficult for Junior to try and pin him up against the ropes. But Junior was coming in with his head, and that caused the clash of heads, which cut Junior. His right eye was cut very early on in the fight, completely self-inflicted. The referee should have warned Junior for leaning in. He was holding George with his left hand whilst hitting him with the right, trying to hook him to the body, trying to uppercut him. George was freeing his right hand, and he was actually, the better infighting was from George Groves. You know, he was able to, he didn't tie up Chris straight away. He was able to fire off, you know, right hands, and then successfully tie up Junior. That is exactly the right thing to do. When you're up against the ropes, you've got no leverage. Your man has his head in your chest, you know, leaning on you, leaning down, holding you up against the ropes as well. And the referee is not enforcing the rules. So George Groves did exactly the right thing to do. And anybody who disagrees with that, saying that George was just unfairly neutralizing, tying him up, avoiding Chris from unloading, has no understanding what infighting means. Go back to the boxing manuals. As the rounds progressed, George was able to land combinations, you know, two pieces, left, right, straight hand. Junior, the success he was having was actually from long distance. He was firing a raking long left hand lead power shots, and occasionally was having some success. But George was composed. He'd never lost his his temperament throughout the fight. At no stage of the fight was George Groves even remotely hurt. And once again, that is experience for you. The only skill that I saw was Chris occasionally counter-punching with that left hand from long range. Now George, was having some difficulty in nailing Chris flush, certainly with the right hand, for the first 4 or 5 rounds. Junior has a difficult style to nail down, especially at wrong range. Now his posture is he has a sideways on profile. Sorry, he doesn't use a sideways on profile. He's a little bit more squarer. His left foot is in front of his right foot, so he's relying on upper body movement. His hand is low, so he's not trying to catch punches, not trying to catch and shoot, not trying to block or parry, trying to rely on his athleticism, trying to rely on his reflexes. When you're slightly more square on, it is easier to slip punches, because you have a wide stance, so you can obviously your knees are bent, so you can obviously shift from the hips to shifting your upper body side to side, bobbing and weaving, and he did that reasonably well at times to evade to slip punches. But as the rounds progressed, Junior was getting ragged. He was getting frustrated. Ultimately, he was a man consumed by emotion. And the emotion was that he was determined to try and knock out George Groves. Hence, he wasn't trying to box him. He wasn't trying to win any rounds. There was no structure to his strategy. His corner did an atrocious job in trying to stem the bleeding. Shaky hands, they couldn't subside the bleeding. Junior was consistently rubbing the eye as well, but to all those Chris Eubank Jr. fanboys, the cut was not faulting his vision. The blood was not seeping into his eyes until later on in the fight, after the 8th round. So that is not an excuse for reducing, minimizing his vision. That's absolute nonsense. But the problem, as I mentioned, was exacerbated by a poor corner who lacked the competency to deal with cuts. George Groves, I think they had Jimmy Tibbs. He was the cut man, a highly experienced trainer. He trained Nigel Benn back in the day. So that was a corner, a professional corner that had a coercion, synergy. Chris Eubank Jr. was relaying some good instructions. He was talking about urgency in the matter. He was talking about George Groves was comfortable at long range, and Junior had to pounce on him, had to show some urgency, so he could unload with some punches. But difficult task when you're up against a puncher, a much bigger man, and a man who hits considerably harder. Junior just relying on brute force, relying on physicality, crudely missing. The crowd were almost mocking his lack of technique. I've heard some narrative that Junior not throwing the jab, that's poor technique. That's got nothing to do with it. Technique is how well you throw the jab. When a fighter doesn't have a jab, that's a lack of skill. A fighter who has a jab but who is reticent to throw it, doesn't throw it enough, that's poor IQ and strategy. Junior does have a jab. You know, you can look at his amateur pictures. He was utilizing a jab a lot back then. Watch the Avni Yildirim fight. He was jabbing reasonably well in that fight as well. Albeit against, you know, against Ed 209. You know, somebody mechanical, couldn't turn left or right. Somebody so slow, couldn't repel any firepower. So, so in all, it was, you know, I can just, you know, record a 9-part video series on this fight, you know, Star Wars style, but what is the point? You know, it was just a mismatch of skill, technique, experience, ring craft, temperament, composure, punching power, defense, pretty much all of the attributes. The scoring, I actually had the fight. Let's get to the scoring. 10 rounds to 2. Well, I think I've been generous. A lot of people said that they had Junior winning the 12th round. Now, actually, George Groves had dislocated his shoulder. Those who've experienced a dislocated shoulder will know the pain that will induce. In the 12th round, Junior, obviously in desperation, trying to win the round, had trapped George Groves up against the ropes, was winging away 5-6 punches. But just go back and look at that exchange. George Groves is using fantastic upper body head movement, slipped all of the punches with one arm as well, through 3 right hands, 1 uppercut. And go back and look at Chris Eubank's demeanor, his body language, his legs. He was hurt badly. So effective aggression, defense, as I've just illustrated, clean punching. George Groves wins the 12th round. You know, that is no dispute there whatsoever. So, you know, a lot of people just clearly do not know how to score a fight. Junior may have won the 3rd, but that is debatable as well. 2 knockdowns, as I mentioned. Chopping left hand. Junior went down hard. There was no tangling of feet, no pushing. Referee scored it a no knockdown, as he would. He was clearly in place to try and he was part of the conspiracy to rob George Groves. I've absolutely no doubt there whatsoever. This was all about the Eubank brand, the Eubank legacy. Eubank, they feel is a man who will generate more money for ITV. Obviously, he has a direct contract with them. George Groves does not. He's a Sauerland fighter. So overall, you know, the fight played out pretty much exactly as I had anticipated. Actually, I did, in my prediction, I did call it an 8 round. It would be an 8 rounds to 4 mismatch for Groves. So maybe I was slightly out there. It was, you know, 10 rounds to 2, but a 118-108 scorecard. I think that's I think that is an accurate scorecard. It wasn't even remotely a close fight. George Groves wasn't hurt at any point apart from a dislocated shoulder. Junior was hurt 7-8 times throughout the fight. He was hurt by jabs, left hands. He was hurt by straight right hands. He was hurt to the body, and his infamous gas tank was Yet another fallacy, a fugazi. He was the one breathing heavily. I didn't see any significant output of his punches in the latter rounds. Maybe a certain bit, but that was more desperation because he was embarrassing himself. He was losing the fight. Comprehensively outboxed, outfought, and he's the fighter. George Groves is the puncher, but George Groves outfought him, even on the inside. Now George Groves, I think he's had an X-ray. I think the shoulder may have popped out, a dislocation. I think the X-ray he had has not revealed any damage to the bone, fortunately for him, because it would be a travesty if he doesn't compete in the final. #1 seed. He has all of the belts. There are no other belts in play from my understanding, apart from some WBC Diamond that Callum Smith and Jürgen Bremer are fighting for next week over in Germany. But that is a totally insignificant belt. David Benavidez has the WBC, the full belt, a belt that Callum Smith had an opportunity to fight for, but he chose to participate in the tournament instead. George Groves recovered from a broken jaw that occurred during the Fedor Chudinov when he won the world title. It took 3 months for him to recover. I've heard him in interviews stating that his body does recover quite expeditiously, so that is good. The finals in June, I believe, so I think he has sufficient time to heal up, to try and work a program of rehabilitation to try and strengthen without inducing too much weight on his left shoulder. The left hand is highly critical to his ability, to his fight makeup. He has a magnificent jab, good chopping left hooks. He sets up his power punches, his right hands, his right crosses, his right hands to the body, so it's integral. So if he's unable to utilize it the way that he needs to, then that certainly would be a concern. But I think he is a man of balls. I think he'll still fight even with 80% shoulder. That's the sort of man he is. He's not a quitter, and credit to him. The deserved victory. He kept reserved during all of the pre-fight build-up to a certain extent. Of course, he had to retaliate a little bit. I'm aware of, somebody he was trying to get under both junior and senior, but that's fighting talk. What are you going to do? You're going to allow a man to sort of dominate you, as much as you try, not to engage in a war of words, but it's just natural. These are fighters at the end of the day. They're not going to let anybody insult them, mock them, berate them. When you're angry, that's what happens. But still, I think he was a lot more reserved than he was in past fights, and that was all into his strategy, to try and goad Junior, let him try and knock him out, and hence, George, just picking him off, outboxing him, and it worked beautifully, and that's a lesson to a lot of these fighters who just talk the talk, but unable to back it up. I think that has done irrevocable damage to Chris Eubank as a commodity, certainly as a pay-per-view commodity in the future, because that's two major fights that he stepped up for. Billy Joe Saunders, that was so much heated exchanges between the both of them, and against a 50% Billy Joe who looks awful back then, comprehensively outboxed in that as well. And last thing I'd like to say to all those who said that George Groves should have knocked him out, or he didn't look that good, or he was missing now. It's a difficult style to fight against now. When you're up against somebody who's wild, who's just trying to knock you out from long range, George Groves I think he was the consummate professional. It is not wise to try and engage, trying to knock out a guy who's throwing wild punches. Some of the punches he's not even looking at when he's throwing. Almost a Ricardo Mayorga style. You want to just try and establish distance, keep the fight at long range, use your better footwork, constantly force him to reset if he's throwing lead power hooks, which George did. He was, at no point was he running at all. He was pretty much in the middle of the ring, setting up ambush tactics, jabbing, taking one step backwards, then firing the right hand. A straightforward, comfortable victory. What more can I say? A lot of disappointed individuals out there. Casual ass bettors. I'd say thank you to them as well. I love a redistribution of wealth from the casual betting fans to my deep receptive pockets. If the bookies can give me an 8-1, 10-1 on Joseph Parker and Anthony Joshua, I'll gladly take that as well. But Joseph Parker hasn't got a chance of winning that fight on points. So but that's another video, another time. Anyway, that was my post-fight breakdown. I should really be playing Big Daddy Kane from his great album in the late 80s, Long Live the Kane, track Another Victory, because that's what it was for us. Yeah, those are my thoughts. Let me know how you guys, your appraisal of the fight. Was you surprised at just how the fight actually everybody was predicting a warfare, but I certainly wasn't. Was you guys disappointed in Chris Eubank Jr.? All of the hype that was behind him. Let me know how you guys scored the fight. I had it 118-108, 10 rounds to 2, and I think I've been being generous. But anyway, corruption in boxing, transmission over.